Centralia, in Columbia County, Pennsylvania, began in the 19th century as an anthracite coal borough built on seams of rock and stitched together by drift mines, breaker piles, company houses, a church, a school, and a single narrow main street. For a century, the town ran on the rhythm of miners' shifts, black dust on porches, colliery whistles, mules in tunnels, and coal company paydays. The landscape was scarred with bell pits, mine entrances, and veins of high-grade anthracite that helped make the region one of America's industrial lungs. Beneath all that activity lay a hidden labyrinth of abandoned tunnels and gulfs, a secret underfoot. On May 27, 1962, a landfill fire meant to clear refuse at the borough's edge ignited waste, slipped into a fracture, and reached a shallow coal seam. Volunteers and local firemen doused the surface blaze, but that was only the beginning. Heat and flame found the hungry anthracite and started a slow, subterranean smoldering. What followed was not a dramatic inferno, but a slow, sulfurous, acrid consumption. Mostly smokeless combustion that crept through old mine workings, heated the strata, produced carbon monoxide and other noxious fumes, and left pockets of hot gas and embers beneath streets, yards, and basements. The ignited seam turned ordinary hazards into a phantom menace, invisible, seething, able to poison without warning and to cause sudden subsidence. That single landfill fire set Centralia on the long path from a functioning coal borough to a place of hissing steam, collapsing ground, sinkholes, and ultimately, a grim evacuation. Within days of the May 27, 1962 landfill blaze, Centralia's volunteers and borough officials treated the problem like a routine municipal nuisance. Volunteers from the Centralia Volunteer Fire Company, neighbors armed with garden hoses and pitchers of sand, shoveled wet dirt onto the smoldering refuse and tamped it down with tractors borrowed from nearby farms. Borough council members and local contractors hauled truckloads of fill to cover fumaroles, patched depressions with concrete and limestone, and ordered routine checks of basements and sidewalks while insisting the town was safe. Those first responses were pragmatic and stubbornly optimistic. No one yet imagined a subterranean ravenous coal seam. Early warning signs were shrugged off as ordinary. Wisps of gray smoke curling from cracks beside Route 61, steam rising from yard soil at dawn, warm flagstones on cellar steps, and an acrid sulfur tang neighbors compared to a coal breaker on a hot day. A state geologist would later identify the odors as carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide. But at the time, people dismissed them as harmless coal dust or smoldering garbage. Firefighters tamped hotspots, bulldozers buried vents, and local papers printed headlines about successful extinguishing efforts. Confidence hardened into routine. Inspectors walked streets, recorded steam vents, and marked shallow sinkholes for temporary filling rather than treating them as red flags. Maybe clicking subscribe would have made them less complacent. The mistake was both technical and psychological. The old drift mines beneath Centralia were only partly mapped. Ownership records were scattered, and most residents could not see how a single landfill fire might connect to the labyrinth below. Yet the ground was already betraying them. New cracks opened across driveways. A low hiss sounded beneath cellar drains, and patches of earth gave off a fetid, searing breath when disturbed. Those small, grotesque signs grew more frequent and more violent, pushing concern beyond complacency and driving calls for outside expertise. By the time state agencies began formal readings, the borough's ad hoc fixes had only driven the smoldering deeper, turning a manageable surface blaze into a concealed, crawling inferno that would not yield to hoses or shovels. Within months, the town moved past denial, and the problem got a technical name: a coal seam fire migrating through abandoned drifts. By 1963, state geologists and engineers from the U.S. Bureau of Mines and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources were systematically probing and drilling boreholes along Route 61, under Main Street, and around the cemetery to track pressure, temperature, and gas. Their maps turned the town's tidy grid into a butcher's diagram of tunnels, gob piles, inclined planes, and interconnected entries dating to the 1800s and early 1900s. The fire was not a single hearth, but a malignant network, moving along seams that split and rejoined, anastomosing, and through gulfs, collapsed workings, sometimes jumping rock barriers and igniting seams yards away. Instruments recorded lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide in crawl spaces and basements, and technicians noted fumaroles, steaming vents that exhaled a sulfurous, acrid stench, and white vapor that often spiked after rain or heat. Small sinkholes opened like rotted mouths in yards and under sidewalks. A child might step on soft turf and reveal a cavity that whispered heat and the smell of burned coal. Practical experiments followed and failed. Volunteers and contractors sealed vents with concrete and clay, and bulldozers and dump trucks filled openings with tons of fill that simply redirected heat deeper. Pumps and hoses tried to flood the workings, but water drained into unknown voids, turning surface flames into smoldering embers and producing toxic carbon monoxide that migrated into houses. Some engineers argued for starving the blaze by sealing every known opening, while others warned that aggressive sealing would force gases into inhabited spaces and spike subterranean temperatures. Proposals ranged from trenching and excavation to controlled burning, each expensive, each risky, each opposed by someone with a stake in the town's survival. Conflicting reports from federal and state teams, painful test readings, and mounting sinkholes transformed an odd municipal nuisance into a stubborn, costly nightmare that could not be hushed with sand and concrete, and set the stage for the political and legal battles to come. Denial unraveled into crisis as obvious dangers spread across Centralia in Columbia County, Pennsylvania. Steaming fumaroles grew from occasional sighs into gulps of fetid air. Yards opened into cratered sinkholes that swallowed porches, sheds, and the crooked iron steps of century-old houses. Instruments from the U.S. Bureau of Mines and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources found basements with lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide and pockets of hydrogen sulfide that stung eyes and lungs. Technicians warned of silent asphyxiation while residents reported headaches, nosebleeds, and chronic throat burns. Route 61, the town's main artery, developed cracks that exhaled a sulfurous breath and buckled under the heat. The road became a crooked scar and a public safety nightmare. Real estate turned toxic on paper and in practice. Assessments cratered, mortgage lenders refused loans, insurance carriers canceled coverage, and property values collapsed as buyers fled and appraisers dropped numbers toward zero. The Centralia Volunteer Fire Company and borough officials found themselves squeezed between outraged homeowners and state engineers as legal and financial liability loomed like a second, spectral threat. Families faced impossible choices: stay and risk invisible gas and sudden subsidence, or accept state buyouts that meant leaving ancestral houses and graves. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania moved to condemn and acquire properties. A bureaucratic amputation meant to stop loss of life, but also a way to shift cost and blame. Community meetings dissolved into shouting matches over compensation and culpability. Lawyers circled, and journalists traced the timeline back to May 27, 1962. While policymakers argued over who would pay for extinguishment, relocation, and remediation. Every new sinkhole and every failed mitigation plan ratcheted pressure higher, converting private grief into public emergency. The town's rhythm, once marked by miners' whistles and coal dust, was replaced by the hiss of vents and the metallic quiet of abandonment, driving people toward the cliff of evacuation and setting the scene for the final, unavoidable decisions that would follow. By the mid-1980s, momentum from cracked streets and dangerous gas readings forced decisive action. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, working with federal partners, moved from study to removal. Teams from the U.S. Bureau of Mines and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources, and later the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, cataloged hazards. State planners began offering federally funded buyouts to residents whose basements registered carbon monoxide or whose yards belched sulfurous steam. Negotiations and purchase offers stretched through the late 1980s. When voluntary sales stalled, the state stepped up its response. In 1992, under Governor Robert P. Casey, Pennsylvania used condemnation and eminent domain to acquire hundreds of parcels in Centralia, concentrating on the most dangerous zones around Main Street, Route 61, and the Old Cemetery. Bulldozers and wrecking crews moved in. Once lively porches, company houses, and clapboard churches were reduced to smoldering rubble and neat piles of siding, their charred timbers carted away. Legal fights erupted in Columbia County courts as a few high-profile holdouts refused to sell, forcing contested hearings and bitter media scenes that focused attention on grave sites, family heirlooms, and stubborn attachments. Ultimately, compensation, condemnation, and demolition produced a mass exodus. Households emptied, telephone poles stood like crooked bones, and Centralia was left a skeletal, hissing landscape that funneled into the town's poisoned silence. On May 27, 1962, a landfill ignition started a fire that has smoldered ever since in the anthracite seam beneath Centralia. That subterranean blaze produces sulfurous fumes, pockets of carbon monoxide, and sudden subsidence, leaving steaming vents and an acrid hiss where streets and yards once were. State and federal responses, including Bureau of Mines probes in the 1960s and Commonwealth condemnations that culminated under Governor Robert P. Casey in 1992, emptied much of the borough, but the fire could not be put out. The dangers remain: buckled earth, hidden hotspots, and poison gases that keep the ground unstable. Displaced residents carry hard losses: burned-out neighborhoods, scattered graves, and a void where Main Street and community rituals once anchored daily life. Centralia became both a horror parable and a policy warning, inspiring documentaries, news coverage, and even influencing the makers of Silent Hill. For environmental managers, it is a case study in the cost of unknown abandoned mines, landfill practices, and the limits of remediation. The town's charred silence asks a blunt question: how many small mistakes will become unquenchable infernos before policy changes, and at what cost?